Vietnam's economic record has been truly impressive. It has also done a phenomenal job in reducing poverty, ensuring full employment, in improving health, and most recently, responding to the COVID-19 crisis. At the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, your public health messages went viral around the world, a symbol of cleverness and liveliness and social commitment. We particularly enjoyed it because it offered such a contrast to what was happening in my own country. While managing the Omicron has been hard, your death rate is a fraction of that of countries such as my own. Part of this is because of your truly impressive performance in vaccination, as several times been mentioned, 200 million doses having been administered. Your ability to manage the disease and to sustain the economy has again been particularly impressive, putting the economic performance among the strongest in the world. But in the midst of these achievements, there are problems and challenges. Inequality has grown, even as absolute poverty has been brought down. Growth has not been as inclusive as it could have been. A problem seen around the world, this growth in inequality, to such an extent that I refer to this as an inequality crisis. COVID-19 has not been an equal opportunity virus. It has exposed and exacerbated the inequalities and has brought the many dimensions of inequality, health, income, inequality, very much to the fore. Another crisis, challenge facing Vietnam and countries around the world is the fact that the environment has not always been treated with the respect that it deserves and with respect that is needed if growth is to be sustainable. The third or a particular example of the environment is climate change. Climate change will pose a particular challenge going forward. All countries in the world have discovered the fragility of the environment and the economic cost of not addressing these environmental challenges. And this is particularly true as we face the challenge of climate change. In the United States, we've been losing every year up between 1% and 2% of GDP to climate-related disasters, wildfires, floods, hurricanes. The cost to the world of not dealing with climate change is enormous. Climate change, though, is a global public good and therefore has to be addressed globally. It is imperative that every country do its part. And I am very pleased that Vietnam has stepped up and made commitments that I'll refer to a little bit later on, to do its part in fighting, in meeting the challenge of climate change. This evening, my time in New York, I have three main messages. The first is that as Vietnam seeks to recover from COVID-19, as it seeks to continue its growth, the money that is spent to recover the economy will have to do triple duty. It will have to help recover the economy. It will have to promote green and sustainable growth, and it will have to address the problem of inequality and inclusive growth. That, of course, is the central message of the Build Back Better agenda that President Biden has been promoting in the United States and the similar agenda that is going on in Europe. The good news is that there exist policies that actually do this triple duty. I undertook a research project with my colleagues, Nick Stern at London School of Economics, Cameron Hepburn at Oxford, and a group of other economists at Oxford. And we identified in multiple countries around the world policies, projects that could simultaneously do this triple duty, help recover the economy, promote green sustainable growth, and address inequality. Indeed, I would argue that not only is it possible, it is necessary to do all these things simultaneously. You won't have long-term growth unless that growth is sustainable. And you won't have sustainable growth unless it's inclusive growth. This is one of the most important messages of my book of a few years ago called The Price of Inequality. I argue that if we don't have inclusive growth, if we ignore the problems of inequality, we will pay a very high price. Not only a price in terms of a divided society, the kinds of political divisions that are so apparent in the United States and many other countries, but actually that a divided society, a divided high level of inequality is bad for economic performance, for growth and stability. Well, when I wrote the book, that message was viewed as, you might say, extreme. The good news is that over the last few years, it has become mainstream. The IMF, clearly historically not a left-wing institution, has adopted this as one of its core messages as it gives advice to countries around the world. The OECD has talked about the importance of inclusive growth for sustainable economic performance. So the first message is that as one formulates one's programs for recovery from COVID-19, one has to make sure that the money does this triple duty. The second message is that to succeed, one has to have a comprehensive strategy, a strategy involving regulations, carbon pricing, and public investment. Prices are important for resource allocation. That's one of the major messages of economics. If we don't price something, we don't direct resources, we don't recognize the scarcity value. And we should recognize now how precious our atmosphere is. And so it's imperative that we price the additions to carbon and other greenhouse gases that are putting our planet at risk. It's important, though, that the prices really reflect the scarcity value, the social cost of adding carbon to the atmosphere. There's been some important work done in trying to estimate the price of carbon. And the price of carbon has to take into account not only the future damage, but the extreme risks that it poses to the entire future. When one does that, when one takes into account the risks, the potential future damage, the kind of carbon price that has to be used is in the order of magnitude of $100 to $125, $150 a ton of carbon, much higher than the prices currently being used in those countries that have undertaken the pricing of carbon. While prices are important for directing resources, they are not sufficient. Regulations have to be part of this comprehensive strategy, and those regulations themselves have to be comprehensive. Among the aspects of the comprehensive regulatory structure, obviously, are those areas like energy, transportation, which are most closely associated with carbon emissions. In the few minutes today, though, I want to emphasize the importance of the financial sector. Financial sector regulations can play an important role in moving the economy in a green direction. For instance, one important set of policies are green mortgages. Only mortgages that should be allowed to be made are mortgages that are based on sound environmental green standards. Investments that we make in houses, buildings, and plant and equipment are going to be with us for decades into the future. If Vietnam is going to meet its commitment to carbon neutrality by 2050, it has to begin now. It has to make sure that the investments that are undertaken today will be consistent with that message of that commitment of carbon neutrality by 2050. And therefore, the mortgages, the buildings that are constructed have to be green. The second aspect, it has to be disclosure. Investors have to know whether the carbon footprint of the investments that are being made. If they don't know the carbon footprint, they won't be able to make the right resource allocations. One of the concerns is that if you don't make green investments today, and not that far down the line, in 2050 is only 28 years away, there will be stranded assets. Investments whose value will be greatly diminished because today, when they're made, they have not been sufficiently green. A third aspect of focus in the financial sector is risk. And regulators, central banks around the world, have become increasingly aware of the systemic risk posed by the transition to a green economy. If we don't make those green investments, I already mentioned that we're going to wind up with stranded assets whose value will greatly diminish. In 2008, we discovered that the mispricing of a small fraction of the US mortgage market, the subprime market, the correction of that mispricing caused a global financial crisis. Unfortunately, at the present time, a large fraction of the world's financial assets are not correctly priced. They don't reflect climate risk. And this is true of the investments in the fossil fuel sector, but it's also true of investments in the real estate sector. Not taking into account this kind of financial risk could, of course, have large systemic consequences. And that's why most central banks today have undertaken an attempt to assess climate risk, both the physical risk and the transition risk. One of the related lessons that have come out of the COVID-19 is that we have discovered that many firms around the world did not take into account adequately a whole range of risks. And we found that the private sector was not as resilient as we thought. In the United States, we couldn't make simple products like face masks and protective gear, let alone complicated products like tests and ventilators. It was because of short-sightedness, the same kind of short-sightedness we saw leading up to the crisis of 2008. And so it's imperative that we have regulatory frameworks, corporate governance frameworks that encourage greater resilience, more long-term thinking, greater attention to risk. And that brings me to the third topic, the third message that I want to share with you. Many people view climate and efforts that I've just described to mitigate climate risk as imposing costs on society. They see it as dampening economic growth, as there being a trade-off between the environment and our economy. I think that's wrong. I see addressing climate change as providing enormous opportunities for growth and creating a more dynamic, inclusive economy. Climate change can create good jobs. There are many more jobs, for instance, in the United States, in installing solar panels and in producing solar panels than there are in the coal industry by an order of magnitude. So climate change has the potential for promoting growth and creating jobs. Some developing countries and emerging markets are seeking delays. They have been slow in making commitments to carbon neutrality. I'm pleased that Vietnam is one of the few developing countries that have stepped up and made a commitment to carbon neutrality by 2050 and made a commitment to the elimination of fossil fuel coal in energy production even faster. I think this view of delay is misguided, and I think Vietnam's approach is the right one. It's better to be in the advance guard in the transition to the green economy. There are enormous potentials for learning how to be a green society. In my book, Creating a Learning Society, I argued that that kind of learning is the basis of sustained economic growth. The economy of the future is going to be a green economy. And by moving more quickly toward that green economy, Vietnam is taking an important step in advancing its own interest in rapid, sustainable, and inclusive growth. So let me conclude. The world and every country is facing today multiple crises. I mentioned the climate crisis, the inequality crisis, the health crisis. For developing countries, even middle-income countries like Vietnam, this is a special challenge because these come on top of the imperative to close the gap that they have in standards of living with the advanced countries. I believe that this is a moment of a special opportunity for Vietnam because we are confronting a geopolitics that is changing before our very eyes. Vietnam has the opportunity to create a more dynamic, green, sustainable, and inclusive society and a green, sustainable, and inclusive economy that has competitive advantages that will attract investments from all over the world and put it in good stead for decades to come. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz, for a very enlightening and very in-depth presentation on the path to recovery and inclusive growth for Vietnam, and especially the three messages that you laid out is very clear and very informative. I would now like to open the floor to invite the participants in this room to have the opportunity to interact with Professor Stiglitz. You can raise questions, you can ask him to clarify his ideas, or you can share your ideas with him. Please. Well, while you are still thinking, I might take my privilege as the moderator to pose the first question. Professor, your first message asked for the money to do a triple job of recovery, sustainable growth, and inclusive growth. I'd like to ask you, how do we then triple the financial resources available to developing countries in order to carry out those three major tasks? How do countries like Vietnam make use of the Build Back Better World scheme by the Western advanced countries to take advantage of that scheme to facilitate the role of the money in an inclusive recovery? If I may, Professor.
Sure. Yeah, there are two aspects of this. One is money from the private sector. The second is from the government, public money. Now, in the private sector, the agenda that I try to lay out is one that I believe will attract foreign investment. And I ended my remarks with a few allusions to the changing geopolitics, which puts Vietnam in a very favorable position because there will be money moving out of the countries that are viewed to be a source of contention, and the new geopolitics is going to result in, I think, new opportunities for a country like Vietnam that creates a good environment. And when I think of a good economic environment, I think exactly of this inclusive, sustainable, environmentally sustainable economy. So that's the first part. By the way, I want to emphasize that too often there's too much emphasis on attracting foreign investment. One also wants to create an environment that is good for domestic investment, that creating opportunities for domestic entrepreneurs is particularly important for long-term growth. And that's where the synergy between inclusiveness and long-term dynamics is important. An inclusive economic strategy entails, as part of it, making sure that there's finance available to young entrepreneurs, not just to big companies. That one of the things that we tried to do in our recovery in the United States was to target money on small businesses, on domestic businesses. And we didn't do it as well as we should have. It was during the previous administration. It was done disproportionately through the big banks. But we learned quickly, I have to say, we learned that we were not allocating as much money in an inclusive way to small businesses and minorities. And as we saw that, we took action to correct. And that is part of the message that I referred to at the end, is creating a learning society. Part of creating a learning society is monitoring closely what is going on, learning from what is going on, and correcting one's mistakes, and being willing to admit those mistakes. And so that was one example where we didn't get it right initially, and we still don't have it perfect, but we did a lot better. Now, on the international arena, I've been a great advocate for more money, for promoting development, and for, in particular, promoting green development. The advanced countries have committed $100 billion a year for climate mitigation. But unfortunately, they have not lived up to their commitments. And I've been agitating that they should live up to those commitments. One vehicle, one way that I have argued that might be brought about is an annual emission of $200 to $300 billion of special drawing rights by the IMF. Many of you may know that the managing director of the IMF advocated in response to the enormous financial needs that COVID-19 was going to present, that there be a special issuance of $650 billion of special drawing rights. They're not an ideal instrument, but they are an instrument that we have available and that could be done quickly. After initial resistance from the US government and a veto, fortunately, under President Biden, that initiative has gone forward, and that $650 billion has been issued. And now the IMF is working very hard to persuade countries, the advanced countries, that don't need these additional foreign exchange reserves, the additional SDRs, to recycle them to those countries that do, and a kind of resiliency trust. And I hope that they will succeed in meeting their goal of $100 billion. But I think this issue of building back better, greener, and more inclusive is something that is of global interest, of global public good, and it is very important for all of us to work together to try to provide for that. Let me make one more comment, though. Vietnam has been very successful in its vaccination, has already been referred to several times, but a very small fraction of the population in the least developed countries and a relatively small fraction of those in many of the emerging markets have been vaccinated. And that too is a global concern, because as long as the disease festers anywhere in the world, it is providing possibilities for mutations that can be more dangerous, more infectious, even vaccine resistant. So it is an imperative for the entire international community to do what Vietnam has done and make sure that everybody is vaccinated.
Thank you very much, Professor, for reminding us that the domestic source of finance is also a very important source that needs to be unlocked in order to fully utilize the potential for inclusive recovery. We've received a couple of questions from online participants. I'll read it out for you, Professor. First question. We all know that solar energy investment is cheaper and cheaper, and becoming solar in many countries can cover somehow energy need and reducing coal and fossil fuel sources. But we need to see what is the technology for solar panel waste in the future that could be affordable and safe to the environment. I would like to hear Professor ideas about the issue. That's the first question. Please go ahead, Professor.
It's a great question. Solar, as you say, has come down in price enormously in a way that was totally unanticipated. And it shows, by the way, the importance of innovation and the importance of carbon pricing and regulations. That decrease in the cost of solar energy occurred with relatively little public investment, relatively weak regulations, and almost no carbon pricing. If we had had real incentives provided by strong pricing, strong regulation, and strong public investment, how much faster, how much earlier, how much more dramatic would the innovation have been? And so I think we need to realize that the potential. This is one of the growth potentials that I emphasized at the end of my talk. I also think, but one of the hopes is that innovation will help us think better about what to do about the waste that you referred to, and develop forms of solar energy that require fewer of the kinds of resources that cannot be recycled, and that make it easier to reduce the waste issue. So I'm very optimistic that if we put our mind to it, and our resources, and our regulatory framework, and our incentive structures, that we will be able to address the problem of waste and get a really environmentally sound solar policy. And that also includes, of course, the problem of storage that is so important with solar.
Thank you, Professor. So innovation and technology is very important solutions. Let's turn now to questions from this auditorium. The gentleman in the middle, please.
Good morning to everybody. I'm Marco Abbiati, Science Attaché at the Embassy of Italy, but I'm also Professor of Environmental Sciences at the University of Bologna. And I would like to thank the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and UNDP for the great opportunity to be here and to listen to the lecture by Professor Stiglitz. And I think that the message that Professor Stiglitz gave to us is extremely clear and strong. But I have a question about the potential role of education in the framework of the green and inclusive rebound. We often speak about economy, technology, innovation, and environment, which are for sure three major pillars for the future of the world. But if we want to go in the direction of equality and inclusive growth, education, I think, should be one of the pillars as well, starting from the primary school, going up to the PhD, having people aware of what are the potentials and what are the risks related to an adoption of not sustainable growth will bring to the world is essential. So I would like to hear to know what your opinion about this, and if we should not stress more that investment also in education is a pillar in order to achieve a green growth. Thank you.
I very strongly agree. You know, one of the points of education is that we learn about the world. It is so that we understand science. Understanding climate change requires understanding science. And responding to climate change requires using science and technology, as I mentioned before. But there's another aspect of education that I would stress and to emphasize what has just been said, and that is education also changes mindsets. It's about opening our eyes in a very broad way. And I'm reminded about this from my grandson when he learned about climate change, became a vegetarian. He realized that as he understood, as a 10-year-old, he understood the challenges facing the world, and that he wanted to do his part. And the one thing that he could do is by eating a more climate-friendly diet. And so by making young people more aware of the challenge that we're facing as a planet, they can become more engaged in the battle. And that's why it's their planet that they will be inheriting. And it's, I find it heartening, the extent to which young people, as they've gotten informed about the consequences, have gotten so engaged in the battle to create climate-friendly economy.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. I think everyone in this room is very thrilled to hear from your third message that the green transition is actually not as costly as it seems, and there are a lot of opportunities created by that process. So I wonder if you can elaborate further on the occupation created from climate change and how we can prepare or equip our current labor force to quickly adapt to the new jobs, new skills, and new requirements.
Yeah, again, a good question, and it links very much with the previous one, because education, one of the important aspects of education is enhancing individuals' adaptability, making them able to respond to the changes in our economy and our society. And we have lots of data to support that more educated individuals are able to go from one job to another. When they get displaced because of a change in technology, they are able to move on to a new job. The reality is that as we move towards a green economy, there will be large changes. I think, as I said before, mostly for the positive. We will be creating lots of jobs, but some jobs will be destroyed. And we have to admit that. We can't pretend, the coal miners' jobs will go away. But what we want is resilient workers that are able to go from the jobs that are going to be lost to the new jobs that are going to be created. And there are going to be a lot of new jobs created. They're going to be in the service sector. They're going to be new sectors of the economy. They're going to be in R&D and the knowledge economy and the innovation economy. One aspect, just to highlight the point I want to make, is that in the short run, there's a lot of jobs that are going to be created as we create an electric, as we change our transportation system. We're going to be creating electric vehicles, public transportation systems. One of the great aspects of electric vehicles is they last a lot longer. They are much easier to repair. So a lot of people whose job has been in the auto repair industry are going to lose their jobs. People haven't begun to talk about it, but it is part of the green transition. But that means we're having a more efficient economy. We will have to spend less resources. We're going to save money. Our transportation system is going to be more efficient. But that means we can do other things that we enjoy more. We may be able to, we'll spend more money on health, we'll spend more money on culture, on various kinds of education. So to me, I think that what is important is that we have this kind of adaptability, of resilience in our society. And that means we have to have adaptable and resilient individuals. And the key to that is education. But our education, let me say one more last thing, our education systems have to be appropriately designed. In other words, too often in the past, we thought of children going to school for 8, 12, 16 years, filling up their minds with knowledge, and then they go out in the world. That's not the way the world is going to be in the future. What we are trying to do in our first 12 and 16 years of education is to teach them how to learn. That's the message of creating a learning society. And then the rest of their life, they continue to learn. And this is one of the big advantages of the new technologies, the internet. People can get access to the best teachers, to the most recent knowledge, it's at their fingertip. In many places around the world, there are courses that are being developed to facilitate this process of lifelong learning. And so the new model of education is going to have to be a model based on lifelong learning, in which the first part is really focused on enhancing the learning capacities. And then there's a big obligation in both the private and public sectors to create both the environment and the tools that enable people to continue that lifelong learning process.